Right, good afternoon. We are reconvening our meeting, and TJ Porter is going to continue with his overview of electricity, hopefully streaming into policy when we get through the 101 basics. Welcome back.
Thank you. For the record again, TJ Poor, Director of Planning at the Public Service Department. And with me this afternoon is Ann Margolis, Deputy Director of the Planning Division at the department.
On screen.
It's virtual, and we'll be running the slides, and we'll do a little back and forth as we get into the policy covering the slides, so you don't have to listen to me all afternoon also. I think just diving in right where we left off, if we can go to slide 20, just really quickly talking about the elements of the electric bill and what's on the electric bill. So we saw the components of what kind of drive the costs on the electric bill, and how that shows up on your electric bill is really on this slide. So there's four main components, although there are others. The first is a customer service charge, which is really designed to recover costs like the meter and the line drop, the connection to your house. That does not, in theory, that would cover all of the fixed costs of your service, but it is not usually big enough to do that. And there's some policy reasons why, and which I'll go into in a second. There's the energy charge, the per kilowatt hour charge. Green Mountain Power is around 18 cents per kilowatt hour. That varies across the state. That's designed to recover the other costs not recovered in the customer service charge. So those energy costs, when I was talking about the variability in energy costs earlier, those are all intended to be covered by the energy charge. There's a number of municipal and cooperative utilities that have different rate structures, that with an initial block, your first 100 kilowatt hours that you use, that is relatively inexpensive, and then a next block that is more expensive. That's kind of the tail block rate. Some of those are developed as a way to allocate power from low-cost resources that have been designated to those utilities. For instance, there's hydropower from New York, from the New York Power Authority, that the federal government has actually delegated that to come into New England and to municipal and cooperative utilities. That usually starts at a lower charge, a lower cost for ratepayers, and then the rest of your usage gets charged the higher rate. And then there's the energy efficiency charge, which I talked about earlier, and demand charges, which doesn't usually apply to residential customers. And those are the ones that are designed to cover those costs from high peak loads, and that kind of variable, if there's a variable demand that spikes, you're paying for that cost on the system. To go back really quickly on the customer service charge, in the variable charge, there's some that would say that your variable energy charge should just be that pass-through for the energy costs, but that might leave a much higher customer charge. And so the customer charge can't just pay for the poles and wires and administrative costs, because it would really turn into, it could turn into a very high charge for low users. And we find that low income customers are often don't use as much energy. So there's an equity component to that. Historically, also, the Public Utility Commission has wanted to put costs into the variable energy charge because it was a disincentive to using more energy. So obviously our policy paradigm has shifted here more recently in wanting to use more energy. So it's important to kind of keep that historical context in mind, equity issues in mind, as we think about what the right balance is of what is kind of that charge on them every month that you get charged with your customer service charge, and what goes into those per kilowatt hour charges. On the next slide, there's just a couple of examples of rates. And the point of this slide, on slide 21, is that it varies quite a bit by utility, what those customer charges are. You can see Ludlow, for instance, or what all the charges are, has just a customer charge of about $9 a month, with that first 100 kilowatt hours really affordable, 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And then above that, every other kilowatt hour you use is at 12 cents a kilowatt hour. GMP kind of in the middle of the range, about $16 a month as a customer charge, with your usage at 18 cents. And they don't have that kind of separate 100 kilowatt hours first. And then WEC has that first 100 kilowatt hours, has a customer charge a little over $25 a month, and then above 100 kilowatt hours is at 21 cents. Now, there's a lot of different factors that go into why the rates are so different. Customer density is one of them. WEC has, I think it's 8 customers per mile, whereas Green Mountain Power has in the high 20s, so 25, 28 customers per mile. And so there's that's a big component of kind of what it costs to actually serve customers. The makeup of your power supply when you bought that, how you've invested in your poles and wires, they all have impacts on service, and that your customer type as well. If you're all residential, you might not have those big commercial customers that might be able to generate more revenue for the utility and cover more of those fixed costs.
Just since it's pretty stark, what's going on in Ludlow? They're a lot less expensive.
Right. So Ludlow, higher customer density, right? They have a small territory in the town, and embedded, they have 2 very big customers. They have Okemo, the ski resort, and they also have a talc mine that's changed hands. I can't remember who the owner is, but those 2 customers are 50-60% of their overall demand. And so the rest of the they contribute to kind of the substation poles and wires costs, and the rest of the customers kind of have spread out the rest of those costs.
And they're probably not drawing very much at night.
I think the talc mine is that depends. So the talc mine, I think, runs 3 shifts depending on their demand. Snowmaking happens a lot at night, and so it depends a little bit. But on the other hand, at night is usually cheaper power to buy on the market, or even if you're entering into contracts for that time, you can get it more affordably. So
Imers, the Ludlow.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I heard recently that they had switched hands again, so maybe it is still called Imerys or Imerys. So when I used to work for VIPSA, it was definitely Imerys. And
there's also a Magris, Magris Telt. I don't know if that's the new one.
That might be the new one.
No.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. So the last slide here, slide 22 on the first part of these the slides here, is the average monthly retail cost of electricity in all sectors, and covered a lot of this earlier in terms of the volatility in the marketplace. You can see over the last year, there's a lot of spikes up and down in all the other states in the region. And that has to do with the restructured nature of every other state versus Vermont maintaining kind of that vertical integration and ability to enter into long-term contracts. There's a trade-off. You can see that Vermont has been relatively stable over time. So we don't have that volatility in rates, but there's states that we historically have been higher priced than Maine and New York, for instance. So there is a little bit of a trade-off where you are potentially paying for kind of that stability with slightly higher rates. And I don't want to overstate that. I'm thinking in the 2%, 4% type of range, higher than, if you were just to play the market over time, you probably would come out lower, but you'd be subject to all those spikes and spikes and drops. Okay, so that finishes up part one of today.
It's on time.
Yeah, it wasn't too bad. Well, let's see if we can get through part two. And then we have about 60 appendix slides if you really are interested. But and we'll get into our core renewable energy policies in Vermont. So I think starting on slide 24, we'll give you a new voice here and let Anne talk about our renewable energy policies.
Great, thanks, TJ. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me to your committee. Excited to get to know a new committee and some folks who were on the prior committee working on energy, and really think it's a great opportunity to keep moving forward here on as we continue to talk about how our renewable energy policies have become what they are today and where they might go. So I'm Anne Margolis, the Deputy Director of the Planning Division at the department. And TJ and I are going to go back and forth on some of these slides, but please just holler if you have questions, if I can't see you. We have a whole slew of renewable energy policies that have evolved over time. They haven't all evolved in tandem with each other, which has been a source of some of the tensions that you might hear us articulate throughout this part of the presentation. Really, one of our more foundational policies is our net metering policy. You probably hear quite a bit about net metering from folks who live in your districts, from other entities who are interested in all of many facets of net metering, from whether it's helping somebody save on their electric bill, whether there's a siting case that involves net metering. It's really quite a hot topic of conversation. We spend quite a bit of time at the department on it from a policy and a siting perspective. Net metering really got its start in the later 90s. Started out pretty simply, as did many of the net metering programs in the country. Really, it is designed to allow a customer to offset and self-generate, offset their electric load through self-generation. And it's really a metering and a billing arrangement where a customer accrues credits on their bill that can offset their consumption. We started out in sort of a netting spin your meter backwards framework, and we still have that part of net metering, but it's also moved toward a billing arrangement where you get a monetary credit on your bill that you can carry forward for 12 months. Initially, the program was smaller in scale in terms of the size of customer that it served, really was focused on residential systems, and expanded again to, for larger systems to help accommodate farms. There was a point in time where there was a cap on how much net metering could be installed. You can see through time, 2008, 2011, 2014, 2017 were major policy changes through the legislature on net metering, generally expanding the program. Net metering used to be pretty complicated in statute when it was in Title 30, Section 219A. It was pages and pages and pages on net metering and the requirements for billing and metering and compensation. That changed basically starting in 2014. We'll get into that a little bit later. Really to put a lot of that decision making, really the nuance and details, into the hands of the Public Utility Commission, with some overall guiding requirements from the legislature in Title 30, Section 8010. So we have net metering. Net metering still exists today. Looks very different in many respects than it did at the start. We also have the Standard Offer Program, which started in 2009. Essentially, that was designed to procure a variety of different technology types, but of a larger scale than we were seeing allowed under net metering. The cap for the size of each of those plants is 2.2 megawatts. So you'll often see plants coming in at 2.2 megawatts, or many 2.2 megawatt plants in that program. There was initially a 50 megawatt tranche, and there were rates that were set in statute. And then that program was expanded to 127.5 megawatts. And it was basically a reverse bid process starting in 2012. So that reverse bid process has led to lower rates for those projects than were in the initial 50 megawatt tranche, which we'll talk about in a bit. And that's conducted through a bidding process that's been historically held annually, with the lowest price projects chosen, but other attributes such as technology type in consideration as well. So we had these two programs, net metering and standard offer. And then we as a state, the legislature, created the Renewable Energy Standard in 2017. And that creates a requirement on the utilities to supply increasing amounts of renewable energy to customers every year. We'll talk about the details of that in a minute. And the net metering and standard offer resources sort of fit under that paradigm, in that both those types of resources are allowed to contribute to what's called Tier 2, or the distributed generation tier of the Renewable Energy Standard. And in fact, net metering since 2017, if the renewable energy credits from a net metering system are assigned to the utility, and that gives extra value to customers for that generation, the utility has to retire those RECs toward their Renewable Energy Standard obligation. The Renewable Energy Standard has 3 tiers. Again, it was enacted in 2015, and it was Act 56 of 2015, and the compliance obligation started in 2017. So we're a few years into the Renewable Energy Standard now. We put out a Renewable Energy Standard annual report and a biennial report every year, and that's part of our annual energy report, Appendix B, I believe, if you want to get into the details there. There are 3 tiers of obligations on the utilities. There's a total renewable requirement, which we call Tier 1. It's called Tier 1, and that's 75% renewable by 2032. And then there is a Tier 2, which is distributed generation. Those are resources 5 megawatts and smaller, interconnected within Vermont, and that are new, basically installed after July 2015. And it's a carve out of Tier 1. So Tier 2 resources count toward Tier 1. And then Tier 3 is the energy transformation tier. This is the sort of utilities helping customers reduce their greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel consumption. And we'll get into that in a little bit, the accounting of that. Tiers 1 and 2, utilities demonstrate compliance through retirement of renewable energy credits of the type that's allowable under each of those tiers. And then I think I'll hand it back to TJ for the exciting prospect of discussing RECs.
That's a very basic question before you go on. What's it called tiers?
So in other states, they're called different classes. I think there's no magic to the word tier. It's just a different grouping. And of course, Vermont called Tier 1, it's kind of existing assets, and the broader umbrella tier, what other states call Class 2, and just to make it confusing. So in Vermont, the Tier 2 is kind of local Vermont small generation, and those are Class 1 in other states. So we did an opposite. There's no magic to the word for the tier.
Oh, it's an impediment for me here. Got to get over it.
You have the power to change it.
That would be awesome.
So those renewable energy credits are, as Anne said, really what are used to determine compliance of utilities towards their renewable energy standard obligations. Every state in New England, and I think 45 out of 50 states in the country, has some sort of renewable energy standard. They usually call them renewable portfolio standards. In the theory, they all use some sort of renewable energy certificate or credit to reflect the attribute of the power and to track compliance. And the theory of the REC is really that it should represent the value of the difference from what a resource could build and get in the open marketplace, and what it between those revenues and what it needs to actually build the resource. So there was kind of like a missing money problem when a lot of these standards were first implemented, that, we'll just use the example of solar. A solar resource wanted to build, it could get, 6, 7, 8 cents in the marketplace, but it really needed 10, 11 cents or 12 cents to actually get built. And so the REC was intended to provide that revenue stream to actually fill that gap and make it financeable, the project financeable, encourage developers to actually build them and build the projects. So,
Representative Stedman.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Interesting. I have never thought of a REC in that way. I've thought of it more as the value of what that resource brings, because it has a renewal, like a non-carbon component to it. But I guess I just ask you, in my mind, we might not need RECs if we didn't have, or an RPS or a RES, if we had, like in DC, a structure in which there were no incentives for any type of energy. We've had incentives for all types of energy for like hundreds of years. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's certainly possible that if energy, if the marketplace was priced in a manner that it was the energy market was more expensive than it was to build a renewable resource, then you don't really need the REC. And so, if you took away all subsidies for fossil fuels, then, maybe that would happen on its own. But if you took away all subsidies for all sources of energy, I don't know where it would land, but it's a possibility. But
sorry, I'm asking a crystal ball.
So I wanted to explain the theory behind the REC of what is intended. In reality, though, that value is really just based on the difference between supply and demand. So we have all these marketplaces. Utilities have obligations. If there's enough renewable energy credits out there to meet those obligations, the price of those will be lower. And if there's not enough projects, the price kind of goes up, and that should then encourage people to build renewable energy. In the REC, more fundamentally, I mentioned that those are the way of assigning ownership of those environmental attributes. One REC equals 1 megawatt hour of generation, so it's really a 1-to-1 ratio, and it creates a marketplace. All these renewable energy standards just create a marketplace so that you can trade these RECs. So in a lot of instances, a solar project built in Vermont, it could qualify for Vermont's tier 2 of the renewable energy standard, or it could also qualify in Vermont for a high value tier. Those attributes will usually follow the money and go, and a utility in Massachusetts may buy the right to call a megawatt hour of theirs renewable, using a REC from a project in Vermont.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. A friend of mine has solar panels, an array on his property. And he gets, if we're talking about the same thing here, he gets these energy credits for power that he generates that he doesn't use above and beyond what he uses for his home. So he can use these credits for what?
So it depends on when his project was built, and what he's chosen when he built the project. If he chose to get a higher incentive for building, or by getting a higher rate for every kilowatt hour he generated, and with that transferring the renewable energy credit to the utility, then that credit is then allows the utility to claim that a megawatt hour is renewable, and he's transferred that attribute to the utility. Now, with net metering, the utility has to retire those credits, so they're required to retire that. So I think there's still an argument that generation is renewable, but the customer doesn't, your constituent doesn't have the right to do anything else with it because it's already gone to the utility. Now, if
They won't write him a check for anything that he doesn't use.
well, they do as part of the net metering. So if he's selected, so as part of the net metering rate to sell that excess generation, they're essentially writing him a check, even though it's offsetting his usage and then some, right? And so for every kilowatt hour he generates, he gets whatever the rate was at the time. It could be 18 cents a kilowatt hour, it could be a little more, a little less. And that's the incentive for generating that he gets.
I don't fully understand that, but it might take some time.
You'll hear it more than once. That's our
Okay.
goal.
Okay, I understand what you're talking about, but I just wanted to
It's very dense.
try to figure out
There's a lot.
if he got a check back so he can pay his taxes with it on his property or.
Oh, right. No, the utility won't cut specific checks. It just comes as an offset to the bill, and then they've got to use that offset within a 12-month period.
So the guy pays no electric bill.
Right.
What it amounts to, but he's also sending power back onto the grid. So he gets nothing additional for the power that he sends back.
He gets a credit.
That he'll never be able to use for
To a
anything.
year, you could use it. Well, yeah, I think it'd be good to move on, and
Okay.
then
You understand what I'm trying
I
to figure
do,
out?
yes, I
Okay.
do. It is
All right.
dense, and yeah, there's going to be chances.
All right, thank you.
And we can follow up afterwards, and Ann actually probably knows net metering better than I do. So the next slide, I wanted to explain the RECs, and then you can see on the left-hand side of this slide is the chart you saw earlier. That is the physical deliveries into Vermont, the entitlements that utilities have, either owned or contracted power. Remember, we talked about that 17% unspecified amount, and so that's what's delivered. So with the renewable energy standard, now we're assigning attributes to that. And based on retirement of those attributes, the mix changes in Vermont. And you can see that over half of Vermont's supply went based on attributes is from Hydro-Quebec, with another 17% from hydropower, still around 18% from nuclear. But the solar goes way down. There's no wind, no biomass, and no farm methane. That's because, like I said earlier, those renewable energy credits are tradable across the region. So, for instance, Connecticut has a specific obligation for biomass generation, electric generation for biomass, which makes those renewable energy credits valuable. And so Vermont utilities sell those attributes from the generation that they own or are contracted with to utilities in Connecticut so that they can claim they have met their standard. And then they replace those by purchasing other attributes from hydroelectric facilities in Vermont or Hydro-Quebec in this instance.
So help us understand the Hydro-Quebec designation as renewable and the difference that puts us in the different place that puts us in regionally with our
right.
other New England states.
So 30 VSA 8002, I think, has definitions for renewable energy, and that includes large-scale hydro. Historically, that has been different from other states. The renewable portfolio standards didn't have a place for large-scale hydro. More recently, states like Massachusetts and Connecticut and New York have created a place for large scale hydro. They, in Massachusetts, for instance, it's called a clean E standard, a clean energy standard, where they have explicitly created space for a certain amount of large hydro, whether it's imported or existing in New England. New York has, New York and Connecticut have done something similar. In the appendix that's online, I don't have it in your slide decks that I handed out, but there's a little summary of each renewable portfolio standard for each state, and you can see there what qualifies in each state. So the other states, well, Vermont for a while was the only one that included resources like Hydro-Quebec as renewable. Others are at least calling it clean, if not renewable in some instances. There's no other questions on this slide. I think I will I'll move on, and I'll pass it back to Anne to go into a little more detail on the renewable energy standard.
So we touched on this a little bit a few slides ago, just digging a little more detail into the renewable energy standard, which we call the RES. If you hear us say RES, that's what we mean. Tier 1 is this total energy tier. So under the requirements under statute, a tier 1 resource is any resource that can deliver into New England, regardless of when it was constructed. So, when you think of RPSs, renewable portfolio standards in general, there's various factors like size, whether it's in-state or out of state, whether it's when it was constructed, the type of resource. Those are all kind of factors that states decide on a state-by-state basis. So under our tier 1 paradigm, this is sort of large resources that can deliver into New England of any vintage. And the requirements started out at 55% of retail sales and escalate to 75% in 2032. And the current requirements is at 59%. So it ratchets up essentially every 3 years, that tier 3 amount or tier 1 amount. There's an alternative compliance payment if a utility basically can't meet its tier 1 obligation, or tier 1 resources are more expensive than the alternative compliance payment, then a utility can make an alternative compliance payment into the Clean Energy Development Fund. I don't believe that's happened to date. The same mechanism exists for tier 2 as well. So the alternative compliance rate was $11.97 per rec in 2023, and that increases by the rate of inflation annually. The rec prices for tier 1 have been relatively low in the past, although we've seen some pressure on those as more states adopt more aggressive renewable energy requirements in the past, say 5 years, especially in the past couple years. Even existing large regional resources are becoming ever more coveted by all of the states as they seek to get highly renewable under their RPSs. Tier 2 is our distributed generation tier. So in terms of all of those factors, these are newer resources. So after June 30th, 2015, they're essentially interconnected within Vermont. And they have, they're smaller, so they're under 5 megawatts. So these are essentially behind the meter to ISO New England. These include, say, your rooftop net metering systems, those standard offer systems that I mentioned earlier. Those go up to about 2.2 megawatts. Net metering goes up to 500 kilowatts. And the utilities have the option to build, so to own or to contract through power purchase agreements for resources up to this 5 megawatt limit that also would serve to meet tier 2 requirements. Those amounts ratchet up to 10% in 2032 after starting at 1% of retail sales in 2017, and then are maintained at 10% thereafter. We're currently at 3.4% for the 2021 compliance year. The alternative compliance payment is listed here at $71.83 per rec. The forecast, the most recent kind of forecasts that we have, or we check those with utilities and other entities that are looking at rec price forecasts, are about $35 a rec in the near term, and then potentially decreasing a little bit as a bunch more resources come online. The one thing I think it's important to say about tier 2 that sometimes gets lost is that as load grows, so as we electrify heating and transportation, the pie grows, the pie that utilities have to meet grows. So 10% of a larger pie is a larger number. Right now, we think that tier 2 essentially requires the deployment in Vermont of somewhere around 30 megawatts per year of new tier 2 resources. That could ratchet up to 40, 50 megawatts per year, depending on how aggressive the pace of electrification is and the magnitude of that electrification. And then I'm happy to answer tier 1 or tier 2 questions. I'm going to hand it over to TJ for tier 3, as he was our Division of Efficiency and Energy Resources Director for a while, and they focused on this tier.
Thanks, Anne. Just one thing to on the tier 1 and 2, if I might just add, on the top right corner of the slide deck and on the slides, there's a little chart in there, and that's really just what the prices have been. So you can see some volatility in tier 2. It was high, and then it got really affordable as more resources were deployed and kind of caught up to renewable portfolio standards. And then some New England states raised their standards, and the price kind of went back up again. In tier 1, it is reflecting what Ann said. It's been really cheap for a while, and in the last year, those costs have really gone up by an order of magnitude, from $1 to $10, or even 50 cents to $10, so up 20 times, which is it can be a pretty significant impact on rates. There's the alternative compliance payment is really the mechanism that the legislature used when passing the renewable energy standard to say, we're willing to accept some costs associated with this policy up to this amount. And I think I just wanted to point that out because it seems like an important component of policy, and it may come up in other contexts as well. Okay, so
We do have a question. It looks like we have two, one from Representative Stebbins and then Pat.
Thanks, Madam Chair. You just said that you've seen the rec prices go up a fair amount over the last year. Is that related to your earlier comment about the war in Ukraine and the broader energy market, or is that because various states in the New England region all are having renewable portfolio standards go in place, or is it a combo of the two, or what do you think is the driving?
I think it's there's a combo of two things that are happening. First is, I think, the latter of what you were talking about. Ann was mentioning how other states have, those resources have become commodities, hot commodities that folks want the attributes from larger scale hydro now. And the second is not necessarily the war in Ukraine. I think it's more there's voluntary markets for businesses who have corporate goals and other entities who really want to show their renewability, and so these private entities are purchasing these attributes and retiring.
Thank you.
Representative Pat.
Just pointing out the prices where things have gone to now in the very early days of the renewable energy markets. I'm going back to like 2005, and $4 or $5 was the going rate at that point. So it's curious that they went down so low and now coming back up to
Right. Right. So those might not have been on the chart.
No. I mean, I understand in current years that's where they've been in current years. Now they've gone up from that.
Right.
But just in terms of my own history, I was selling Rex for
Yeah.
$4 or $5 into Connecticut back then.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah. Now they're worth $35. Okay, so on to energy transformation. So the purpose of this tier was to support fossil fuel reductions for utility customers. So not related to electricity procurement, but to actually as a mechanism to address thermal heat usage or thermal usage, or even, I should say, as a mechanism to address our fossil fuel usage, so thermal sector, transportation sector. What's eligible for tier 3 are electric vehicles, heat pumps. If a utility provides an incentive or otherwise encourages a customer to transition, they can claim credit towards its obligation. We've seen a lot of line extensions, sugaring operations that use diesel generators, and instead are now using electricity to boil their sap, and they're able to not use that electricity at peak times, so it can be low cost, support the line extension, and it kind of creates that incentive to get their customers off of fossil fuel. And can be a win-win in driving revenue to the utility. The required amounts here, they started lower at 2% of retail sales in 2017 and increasing to 12% of 2032. And it's measured by taking the fossil fuel reductions and translating that into a megawatt hour equivalent. So to put it in electricity terms, so you can then measure it on your electric portfolio. And then to the extent that your portfolio is dirty, you would get a penalty because you're adding electric consumption that then is, emitting fossil fuel, emitting greenhouse gases or using fossil fuels. If you would get a penalty. So there's been some, I don't know how big it is, but there is some small encouragement for utilities, even above and beyond their renewable energy standard requirements for their portfolio, to clean up their portfolio so that they don't get penalized for transitioning people to electricity. I'm not sure if that made a whole lot of sense. Hopefully I explained that well.
Representative Sebelius.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you're through this slide.
Just about through this slide. This cost to basically ultimately translate to about the same type of cost as tier 2, around $30-something a megawatt hour. But that doesn't include, that's offset by the electric revenues that are generated by, more electric sales to the extent utilities are electrifying. There's other measures like weatherization is actually an eligible measure. I think only one utility has supported weatherization so far. That's WEC. And part of the reason of that is because there's no electric sales associated with it. And that's, I think other utilities have chosen to go in a different direction. Okay, now I'm done with this slide.
Go ahead. So question around the tier 2 RECs being eligible in tier 3. Could it go the other way? What would be the impediments to it going the other way, or the factors to consider? So tier 3 being eligible in tier 2.
So just for everybody's benefit, I forgot to mention that those tier 2 RECs, if you generated a renewable energy credit from solar, you could use that for tier 3 also. And that's been done a little bit, but it's not the primary source of credits generated. Could you, right now you cannot, it's not allowed to go from tier 3 and use that to comply with tier 2 or tier 1. I think tier 1 and tier 2 are really around the power supply portfolio. So if you, for instance, let's take it to an extreme. If tier 1 was a requirement for 100% renewable, but then you used a credit that was generated from thermal savings to meet that, then you might not be, your power supply might actually not be 100% renewable by its attributes anymore, because you've kind of used this credit from another fuel source or another market in order to meet that other obligation. I think of tiers 1 and 2 as really for like that power procurement types of tiers, and tier 3 is separate because it really focuses on, it has different goals. It's for. Okay, and then so the next slide is what the types of measures that you've seen. I guess I could have shown this while I talked through that. Most of the measures in 2021 have been from heat pumps. So utilities provide an incentive for customers to install heat pumps. Those are usually kind of upstream or midstream of the customer. So it happens through the contractor or even through kind of the retailer, that the price of the heat pump itself is bought down. And they get megawatt hour equivalent savings there's a calculation that's done by a technical advisory group to say each heat pump on average reduces fossil consumption by X amount, between 20 and 40%, depending on the type of heat pump. And then we translate that into the megawatt hour equivalent in order to count savings.
Why would it be based on the type of heat pump and not by the type of fuel displaced?
It's also on the type of fuel displaced, but by a type of heat pump, it's really the sizing. So there's heat pumps, just like your air conditioner, right? You can get a small one that's meant for one room and a certain amount of output, or you could have a bigger one. Heat pumps come in different sizes, and so they'd be assigned different amounts that they can displace. There's also differences for if you're putting a heat pump into a home that's already weatherized, you get more credit because you're not kind of losing the heat gain. And so there's a few different other variables in there.
So when my heat pumps were installed, somebody was filling this out?
The state does it on average for heat pumps because there's like 13,000 of them, right, a year right now. So that get installed. So the state has looked at, on average, what are the savings? And we've done, the Department of Public Service has done a study a couple of years ago, and we're starting another one to kind of do a representative sample and see how much in a few hundred homes, like look at the performance of heat pumps. And then we can say, extrapolate that performance to all of the heat pumps that
I get that part of it, but like the weatherization or the type of fuel displaced.
In that instance, we're using state averages of the amount of fuel. I guess that's unless you're in, Vermont gas territory is a little bit different, but for the rest of the state, we don't always have information. I mean, people can just get that point of sale rebate, and I think the administrative costs of tracking each individual one outweigh the benefit you get from, just using the averages or the averages.
Yeah, no, I was just trying to understand how you're giving these credits to the,
right. Yeah.
It doesn't it's pretty, it's not.
Yeah. It is. It gets very technical, and there's a what's called a technical advisory group that the Public Utility Commission oversees, and that group is made up of the obligated entities, the Department of Public Service, and then the distribution utilities contract with VEIC to help manage it and do some particular studies. in order to get a bead on what those savings should be. Separately, the department does when there's a really big measure or we're uncertain about what the savings might be, we do our own independent studies to try and verify. And sometimes we partner with other states so that, like if Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont have heat pump programs, we can have those states help fund it and kind of get a northern New England value. And then we provide the results of the analysis to the technical advisory group, and then we come up with appropriate values. After we did our first study, the value of heat pumps were cut in half. So there was assumptions when this was first put in place, and then once we actually saw the operating characteristics of the heat pumps and how they were being installed, what their performance was, what their electric usage was, the amount of savings that were assigned to each heat pump were cut basically in half. We're going to do that study again to see, as you get your second heat pump in your house, that is not necessarily the same value as the first one. And so, that's just one piece, and see how the operating characteristics have changed and if there's other variables we need to look at.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not a question, but just a comment. Some of these distributors will actually come into your home and actually do an analysis of your rooms for you to make sure you have the properly sized heat pump.
Oh, yeah, I haven't done that.
So I think we're going to flip back and do a little deeper dive into net metering.
I think actually we might take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Then we'll be back at 2:15. Keep the pacing on.
Sounds good.
Doing well.